When I bought my house out in the country, just beyond the manicured neighborhoods and cookie-cutter subdivisions, I thought I had escaped the nightmare of homeowners associations forever. But apparently, HOA Karen didn't get the memo because from the day I moved in, she acted like my property was already under her thumb, showing up uninvited with her clipboard, rattling off community standards I never agreed to, and insisting that my freedom out here somehow threatened the aesthetic integrity of her little kingdom 2 streets over. At first, I laughed it off, thinking she was just nosy, but the visits turned into letters, the letters into fines, and when I ignored those fines since I wasn't even in her HOA to begin with, the harassment escalated into late-night calls and veiled threats about consequences. I tried to brush it off, but then one evening, while I was out on the porch with my coffee, I noticed a car parked at the end of the driveway, engine idling, windows tinted. 2 big guys got out, the kind of guys with necks thicker than their heads, tattoos running down their arms, and an air of arrogance that screamed they'd been paid to scare someone. They walked up my gravel path like they owned it, and one of them grinned as if this was just another day at work. My dog, a trained German shepherd with ears like radar and teeth like steel traps, was at my side before I even stood up. He growled low, the kind of growl that vibrates through your chest, the kind of sound that makes men pause. And pause they did, but only for a second. "Karen sent us," the taller one said, his voice dripping with menace, like saying her name was supposed to mean something to me, like it was some badge of authority. I almost laughed. Instead, I kept my voice calm and steady. "You're trespassing. Leave now." But they didn't. They smirked, took another step, and the shorter one cracked his knuckles, saying, "She wants you signed into the HOA today, or things get ugly." And that's when it hit me this wasn't some empty bluff anymore. This was extortion, intimidation, maybe even worse. My canine was practically vibrating with restrained fury, teeth bared, eyes locked on them like laser sights. I held him back with a word, because the truth is, I didn't need to unleash him yet. I had something else they weren't expecting. My shotgun rested inside by the door, legally owned, legally ready, and I was well within my rights to defend myself on my own land. But I didn't grab it yet. No, first, I wanted to see how far these guys were willing to go, how much of Karen's insanity they had signed up for. I leaned forward slightly, my hand resting on the doorframe, and I told them, "You've got 5 seconds to turn around before you regret being here." The taller one laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it, because my dog hadn't stopped growling, his eyes locked on their every twitch. The shorter one sneered, spitting in the dirt, muttering something about teaching me a lesson. That was the moment I realized Karen had crossed a line she could never walk back from, because when you send thugs onto someone else's property, you're not just playing HOA president anymore. You're playing with fire. And sooner or later, you're going to get burned. The standoff on my porch stretched into one of those moments where time feels heavier, like every second lasts an eternity. My German shepherd's growl cutting through the humid air, the 2 hired thugs pretending to look braver than they really were, and me, standing calm but coiled like a spring, weighing every option in my head. Because this wasn't just about a couple of meatheads trespassing. This was about principle, my land, my freedom, my right to live without the chokehold of an HOA that I never signed up for. The taller one puffed his chest, stepping closer, his boots crunching against the gravel with each arrogant stride, while the shorter one started circling like he thought he could flank me. But he hadn't accounted for my canine, who tracked his every move, eyes sharp, hackles raised, body tensed like a coiled predator waiting for a single command. "Last chance, buddy," the taller one sneered, his voice thick with false bravado. "Sign the papers, or we make sure you regret it." He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket and waved it around like it was some binding contract, probably something Karen cooked up on her printer that morning, meaningless outside of her little fantasy world. I stared at it for a long second, then let out a laugh that made both of them hesitate. Because I wasn't laughing nervously, I was laughing at the sheer insanity of it all. "That," I said, nodding at the paper, "is worth less than the dirt under your boots. And you're standing on my property, threatening me, which means you've already lost." The shorter thug spat again, muttering under his breath about teaching me respect, And that's when I decided enough was enough. With one sharp word, my canine lunged forward, barking so loud it echoed off the trees, his teeth snapping inches from the shorter guy's hand. He stumbled back, cursing, nearly tripping over his own boots. The taller one shouted, reaching for something under his jacket, but that was his second mistake. I stepped back, swung the door open, and returned a moment later with my shotgun cradled across my arms. Not pointed, not reckless, just steady and visible. A clear message that the game was over. The effect was immediate. Their smirks vanished, replaced by wide eyes and twitchy hands, the kind of fear you can't fake. My voice stayed calm, steady, deliberate. You have 5 seconds to get off my land. 5, 4. My canine barked again, pacing like a soldier on guard, his body between me and them, every muscle ready to strike. The shorter one backed away fast, mumbling something about not being paid enough for this, but the taller one hesitated, still clinging to the illusion of control. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched, but the truth was written all over his face. He was scared. He knew they were in over their heads. I lowered the barrel just enough to make my point crystal clear. And that's when he finally cracked. He cursed under his breath, turned sharply, and started retreating, dragging his partner with him, their tough guy act completely shattered. But before they got back into their car, he turned and shouted down the driveway, "This isn't over. Karen will be back." And then they were gone, tires spitting gravel as they sped away, leaving nothing but dust and the sound of my dog's heavy panting. I stood there for a long moment, watching the clouds settle, my shotgun still in hand, my canine still pacing, adrenaline pumping through my veins like fire. That's when it hit me. Karen hadn't just sent these guys to scare me. She had escalated this into something far more dangerous. And if I didn't get ahead of it, next time it wouldn't just be intimidation. Next time, it could be worse. That's when I picked up the phone and made a call that would bring this whole insane ordeal crashing down around her. Because if Karen wanted to play games with thugs and threats, I was about to bring in someone she couldn't bully, couldn't fine, couldn't intimidate. The sheriff himself. The second I hung up the phone with dispatch, I knew this was no longer just a neighborhood dispute or some petty HOA squabble. This was criminal. And it was time the sheriff himself stepped in to put an end to Karen's reign of intimidation once and for all. Because if she was willing to send hired muscle onto my land just to force me into her HOA fantasy, then there was no telling what line she'd cross next. And I wasn't about to wait around for her to get bolder. I paced the porch with my canine at my side, his ears still perked, his growl occasionally rumbling like thunder when he caught the lingering scent of those thugs, and I kept my shotgun propped visibly against the railing, not as a threat but as a reminder this was my land, and I was fully within my rights to defend it. It wasn't long before I heard the low hum of tires on gravel, and then the flashing lights appeared at the top of my driveway, cutting sharp beams across the trees as the sheriff's cruiser rolled in slow and steady. No rush, no panic, just the deliberate arrival of a man who knew he was walking into a mess. The car stopped halfway up the drive, dust curling into the sunlight, and out stepped Sheriff Daniels, a man whose presence alone was enough to settle a crowd, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of no-nonsense lawman who carried his authority like a second skin. He took one look at me, at the shotgun, at the pacing canine, and then nodded once, calm, collected. "Heard you had some uninvited guests," he said, his voice carrying the weight of both experience and expectation. I gave him a quick rundown, every detail sharp and exact, from the way they parked at the end of my drive, to their threats, to the so-called contract Karen had cooked up. Daniels listened, arms crossed, his eyes narrowing slightly with each word. When I finished, he gave a slow whistle and shook his head. "She really thinks she runs this county, doesn't she?" he muttered, more to himself than to me. But before I could respond, another vehicle appeared, and my jaw clenched when I saw it was Karen's shiny white SUV, rolling in like she owned the place, her window already down, her voice shrill even before the tires stopped. "Officer, Sheriff, this man is dangerous. He pulled a gun on my associates," she screamed, pointing a finger at me so hard I thought it might snap. Daniels turned his head slowly, giving her a look that could freeze fire. "Your associates trespassed on private property, ma'am," he said evenly. That's a crime. And if what I'm hearing is true, you're the one who sent them. Karen's face flushed a deep red, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for some magical excuse. She sputtered about community rules and mandatory compliance, waving her clipboard like it was the Constitution itself. But Daniels wasn't buying it. He stepped forward, his boots crunching deliberately on the gravel, and leaned slightly toward her window. "This land is not under your HOA," he said, his voice low but firm enough that every neighbor who had crept closer to watch could hear. "You have no jurisdiction here. Sending men to threaten your neighbor? That's criminal harassment, maybe even conspiracy. And if you think waving around a fake contract is going to hold up in my county, you've lost your mind." The crowd behind me murmured, whispers rippling like a wave, because everyone knew Karen thrived on fear, on bluster, on intimidation, and here she was, being stripped of all that power in front of the one man she couldn't bully. Karen tried to backpedal, her voice cracking as she insisted they were just volunteers from the HOA, that they only came to talk. But Daniels had already pulled out his notepad, jotting down names, details, every shred of information I gave him about the thugs. My canine barked once, sharp and sudden, as if punctuating the moment, and Karen flinched so hard she nearly dropped her precious clipboard. Daniels gave me a nod, then turned back to her. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." The silence that followed was deafening. Neighbors holding their breath. Karen's face frozen in shock. She stammered, You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president." Daniels didn't even blink. Out of the vehicle. And in that instant, for the first time since I'd moved here, I saw Karen stripped bare, not the iron-fisted tyrant, not the self-appointed queen of property lines and lawn heights, but just a scared woman. Realizing the sheriff wasn't here to play her game, she slammed her clipboard down, stepped out, and tried once more to salvage her pride with a screech about me being a dangerous vigilante. But the neighbors weren't siding with her anymore. They'd seen enough. And as Daniels took her statement with the cold efficiency of a man already building a case, I knew this was only the beginning of her downfall. Karen's voice grew shriller by the second, echoing across the cul-de-sac like a siren nobody wanted to hear, her hands flailing as she tried to spin a story about being concerned for community safety and how my canine and my shotgun made me a menace. But Sheriff Daniels wasn't swayed for even a heartbeat, because the law wasn't about emotions or clipboards. It was about facts, and the facts were stacked against her like a mountain she could never climb. He let her ramble just long enough for the neighbors to hear how ridiculous she sounded, then calmly held up a hand to silence her. "Ma'am," he said, voice steady as granite, "your actions tonight weren't about community safety. They were about intimidation, harassment, and trespassing. You sent 2 men onto private property to force a homeowner into something he is not legally obligated to join. That's coercion. Plain and simple. And it's against the law." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp, and Karen's face crumpled, her bravado faltering as she realized the sheriff wasn't buying her act. Around us, neighbors shifted uneasily, murmuring to each other, their years of quiet resentment against her bubbling to the surface. Some crossed their arms, some shook their heads, and 1 or 2 even smirked openly, savoring the long overdue comeuppance. Daniels motioned for me to step closer, and when I did, he asked me to recount exactly what happened again, this time in front of Karen, so every word hit like a hammer. I told them about the car idling at the end of my drive, the thugs stomping up with their fake contract, the threats, the way my canine had to hold them back, and finally how I retrieved my shotgun only after they made it clear they weren't leaving peacefully. Karen tried to interrupt, screeching about me, brandishing a firearm, but Daniels shut her down with a single look. "He was within his rights," the sheriff said flatly. "You sent men onto his land. If his dog had attacked, if his shotgun had been used, that would have been on you." That silence, after his words, was almost sweeter than the justice itself, because for the first time since moving here, Karen had no defense, no rule book to hide behind, no HOA fine to dangle over anyone's head. She was exposed, raw, cornered. And then came the knockout punch. Daniels radioed in, gave a quick rundown of the situation, and ordered a unit to pick up the 2 thugs for questioning. "We'll see what they have to say about who sent them," he added, staring directly at Karen until her face turned the color of chalk. She sputtered something about just asking for help and miscommunication, but her words were nothing but noise now, drowned out by the sound of neighbors whispering and even chuckling, the illusion of her power shattering piece by piece. Daniels closed his notepad, clipped his pen, and said the words everyone had been waiting to hear. "Ma'am, you are not above the law. If you continue this behavior, if you harass or send anyone else after this man, you will be arrested and charged." Do I make myself clear? Karen's jaw worked, but no sound came out, just a strangled squeak of humiliation. Finally, she nodded, small and defeated, her clipboard slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the gravel. The sheriff turned to me then, his voice softening slightly. "You did the right thing calling us. Keep documenting everything, and if she so much as sets foot on your property again, we'll handle it." He gave my canine an approving nod, even reaching down to scratch him behind the ears, and my dog, still tense but proud, wagged his tail like he understood he'd just been commended for a job well done. As Daniels returned to his cruiser, the neighbors began dispersing, some shooting me looks of respect, others outright grinning as they passed Karen, who stood frozen on the spot, humiliated and powerless. For years, she had been the tyrant with the clipboard, the woman who struck fear into everyone, with threats of fines and enforcement. Tonight, she was just another resident, scolded like a child, her thugs in custody, her authority shredded in front of the very people she once lorded over. And me? I stood tall on my porch, my shotgun back in its place, my canine sitting loyally by my side, knowing the battle was finally over. Karen had wanted me broken, submissive, bent to her will, but instead, she had triggered her own downfall. And the sheriff, the law itself, had made sure there was no mistaking it. I wasn't in her HOA. I never would be. And no amount of thugs, threats, or clipboards would ever change that.